Chapter 1, The Quiet Evening. The city was unusually still that evening, as though it were holding its breath. The last colors of the sunset had long faded, leaving the sky painted in shades of deep indigo. Street lamps buzzed to life, their yellow glow spilling across the cracked sidewalks and empty storefronts. A thin wind slithered through the alleys, carrying with it the faint smell of rain even though the skies were clear. Down one of those long, deserted streets walked a man. He wasn't hurrying, his steps were steady, deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. He carried no bag, no obvious purpose, just his hands tucked deep into the pockets of a worn jacket. His shoes tapped softly against the pavement, each sound amplified in the silence around him. To an observer, he was unremarkable, an ordinary figure blending into the shadows of the city. Yet, there was something in his calmness, a weight in the way he carried himself, that might have unsettled anyone who looked too closely. A flickering streetlight overhead buzzed and hummed. The man glanced at it briefly, then lowered his gaze again, unbothered. He seemed detached, as if his thoughts were miles away from the empty street he was walking. Occasionally, he would glance at the dimly lit windows of the closed shops, scanning them quickly before returning to his quiet pace. If someone were paying attention, they might have wondered, was he merely walking home, or was he watching for something? For several minutes, the only sound was the steady rhythm of his footsteps and the whisper of the wind. The city might as well have been abandoned. But then, the silence was broken by the low growl of an approaching engine. Headlights spilled into the street, cutting through the darkness. A police cruiser rolled slowly around the corner, its tires crunching against loose gravel. The man didn't look back. He didn't quicken his pace or falter, he simply continued walking as though the car weren't there. The patrol car's headlights washed over him, casting his long shadow onto the road. Inside the cruiser, two officers exchanged glances. It was an uneventful shift, too uneventful, and boredom often turned into suspicion. An empty street, a solitary figure, and silence thick enough to hear one's own heartbeat, that was enough to make any cop restless. "Looks odd, doesn't he?" one officer muttered, his fingers tapping on the steering wheel. "Middle of the night, walking alone, no car, no backpack," the other replied. "Could be nothing. Could be something. Yeah. Let's check it out." The cruiser's engine rumbled louder as it pulled up alongside the man. The red and blue lights didn't flash, but the slow crawl of the vehicle was signal enough. The man, still calm, still steady, finally paused. He turned his head just slightly, his eyes meeting the reflection of the headlights in the shop window ahead. "Evening, sir," one of the officers called as he stepped out of the car. His voice carried the casual authority of someone who expected compliance. "Mind telling us what you're doing out here?" The man said nothing. His expression remained unreadable, a mask of composure. He turned his head toward them, acknowledging their presence with the faintest nod, but no words followed. The second officer got out as well, adjusting his belt as he approached. "Sir, this is just a routine question. Where are you headed?" Again, silence. The man's hands remained buried in his pockets. He wasn't defiant, wasn't hostile, just silent. The officers exchanged another look, this time more uneasy than curious. Silence could be louder than words, it pressed into the air, challenging them. Suspicion stirred, uninvited but persistent. What kind of man walked alone at this hour and refused to speak? The first officer's tone hardened. "Sir, I'll ask again. What's your business here tonight?" The man's lips pressed together, but still no answer came. His eyes, sharp, calculating, watched them closely, as if weighing every detail of their stance, their voices, their movements. The officers shifted uncomfortably. Training told them silence often meant guilt. And guilt demanded action. The street, once so peaceful, now felt charged with unseen tension. The faint hum of the cruiser's engine underscored the standoff. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and the sound seemed to echo forever before fading. Finally, the second officer took a step closer. "All right, sir. We're going to need you to come with us." The man blinked slowly, almost lazily, as if the words meant little to him. He didn't protest. He didn't run. He simply allowed them to move closer. Hands reached out, and in another moment, cold steel handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The cuffs glinted under the streetlight as the officers guided him toward the cruiser. To them, it felt like the right decision, an act of control in an uncertain situation. To the man, it was nothing more than another step in a story only he understood. As the door of the police car shut behind him, the night grew quiet once more. The empty street, the flickering lamp, the faint breeze, it was as though the city itself had returned to silence, waiting for what would come next. But this was only the beginning. Chapter 2, Suspicion Sparks. The ride to the station was quiet, but not the comfortable kind of quiet. It was heavy, tense, thick enough that even the hum of the patrol car's engine couldn't smooth it over. The man sat in the back seat, his hands cuffed, his face turned toward the window. City lights streaked past, reflecting in his eyes, but his expression never changed. Calm. Silent. Almost as if he'd expected this all along. The officers up front kept stealing glances at him through the rearview mirror. His silence unsettled them. Most people arrested, even the innocent ones, protested. They argued, shouted, begged. But this man? Nothing. No plea, no anger, not even confusion. Just silence. "What do you make of him?" the driver finally muttered, breaking the uneasy quiet. The other officer shrugged but kept his eyes on the figure in the mirror. "Doesn't add up. He doesn't look like a drunk, doesn't look homeless, doesn't even look scared. Just calm. Too calm." "Could be trouble," the driver said. "The quiet ones usually are." The man blinked slowly, as though he'd heard the exchange but chose not to respond. His posture was straight, almost military-like, even in the back seat of a squad car. He seemed out of place, not like a suspect but like someone simply tolerating a minor inconvenience. The cruiser pulled into the station lot and rolled to a stop. The officers climbed out and opened the back door, motioning for him to step out. The man complied without hesitation, his movements controlled, measured, almost rehearsed. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh, sterile white. The man was led past the front desk, where another officer raised an eyebrow. "Pick him up for something?" he asked casually. The arresting officer gave a short nod. "Suspicious behavior. Wouldn't answer questions." The desk officer's gaze lingered on the man. "He doesn't look like your usual street trouble." "Tell me about it," the first officer muttered under his breath. They guided the man into a small interview room, a bare, cold space with a metal table and 2 chairs. The kind of room designed to strip away comfort and reveal truth. The man sat quietly, folding his hands on the table, his eyes steady and unflinching. The officers remained standing for a moment, uncertain. They had done this hundreds of times, but something about this suspect felt different. His silence wasn't the silence of fear, it was the silence of control. One officer leaned forward, planting his hands firmly on the table. "All right, let's make this simple. Who are you? What are you doing out there tonight?" The man's eyes flicked up to meet his. The room seemed to tighten, the air heavier, as if the answer, if it came, would change everything. But again, nothing. Just silence. The second officer tried another angle. "Look, we don't want this to get complicated. Just give us a name, maybe some ID, and if it checks out, you'll be out of here in no time." The man tilted his head slightly, considering the words. His lips parted just enough to suggest he might finally speak. The officers leaned in. But instead of words, he exhaled softly and leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. Frustration began to creep into the officers' voices. "This isn't a game. You can't just sit there and say nothing. You're not helping yourself." Still, the man didn't flinch. He looked at them the way one might look at a puzzle that wasn't worth solving. His silence wasn't passive, it was deliberate. A wall they couldn't scale. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. The ticking of the clock on the wall grew louder with each passing second. The officers began exchanging uneasy glances, their confidence slipping. They had control of the room, but somehow it felt like the man was in charge. Finally, one officer slammed a file onto the table, though it was empty. "Fine. If you won't talk, we'll find out ourselves. Let's start with your pockets." They reached for the man's jacket. He didn't resist, he simply watched, his eyes sharp, calculating, as though measuring every movement. And then, tucked into his inside pocket, they found it, a small, worn leather wallet. The officer opened it slowly, pulling out an identification card. He squinted at the name, reading it under his breath. For a moment, his words faltered. His brows furrowed. His mouth hung open slightly as though he wasn't sure he was reading it correctly. "Wait, this can't be right." The other officer leaned in. His eyes scanned the card, and his face went pale. Silence consumed the room. The man sat perfectly still, his faint, knowing smile flickering at the corners of his mouth. The atmosphere shifted. What had started as suspicion was morphing into shock, and soon, fear. Chapter 3, Unjust Arrest. The cuffs had been cold against his wrists, but he hadn't resisted. He hadn't spoken. Not one word. And that silence alone had sealed his fate. For the officers, silence meant defiance. Silence meant hiding something. And in the lonely stillness of that street, silence had felt like guilt. When they first moved in on him, it wasn't with hostility but with the stiff caution of men unsure of what they were dealing with. One officer stepped forward, palm resting on the grip of his holstered weapon, while the other gave the same tired command he'd given 100 times before. "Hands where we can see them." The man obeyed, slowly lifting his hands, his expression calm, almost indifferent. There was no panic in his eyes, no anger in his movements, just an eerie stillness, as though he had surrendered long before the words were spoken. The officer nodded to his partner, who stepped forward with the handcuffs. The metal clicked shut with the sound of finality. For the officers, it was the sound of control regained. For the man, it was merely the sound of inevitability. "You're coming with us," the first officer said, his tone flat but edged with authority. The man gave a single blink, nothing more. No argument. No questions. They guided him toward the patrol car. The cuffs restricted his stride, forcing him into an awkward rhythm, but he didn't stumble. Each step was measured, deliberate, almost dignified, as though even in chains he retained a sense of command. The street was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet as before. It was heavier now, haunted by the echo of the choice they had just made. A lone curtain shifted in one of the buildings nearby, someone had been watching. A pair of eyes, curious but unwilling to intervene, quickly disappeared back into the shadows. At the car, the officers opened the back door and guided him inside. He ducked his head slightly to avoid hitting the frame, sliding into the back seat with the composure of a man stepping into a taxi rather than a squad car. The door shut behind him with a dull thud. The sound seemed to close off more than just space, it closed off options, closed off explanations. In that moment, he wasn't a man on a walk, he was a suspect. And suspects had no voice until someone gave them one. One officer exhaled sharply, trying to mask his unease. See? Easy enough. Didn't even fight it. His partner adjusted his belt, eyes still fixed on the rearview mirror. That's the part that bothers me. They climbed in, the driver turning the key, the cruiser rumbling to life. Red and blue lights didn't flash, they didn't need them. This wasn't an arrest they'd wanted to advertise. The man leaned his head against the glass, watching the city crawl by as the car rolled forward. Neon signs blinked, casting fractured light across his face. His eyes weren't panicked, they were observant, scanning every alley, every reflection, as though he were cataloging details invisible to anyone else. The silence stretched on, unbearable for the officers. Most people get mouthy, one finally muttered. They kick, scream, say it's all a mistake. But him? He jerked his thumb toward the back seat. It's like he knows something we don't. The other officer didn't answer, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened. They pulled into the police station's lot, gravel crunching under the tires. The cruiser slid into a parking space, headlights flicking off. The building loomed above them, its windows glowing with the cold light of bureaucracy. The officers stepped out, opening the back door. All right, out. The man obeyed. His movements were still calm, unhurried. He didn't stumble or resist as they guided him inside. To anyone watching, it might have seemed routine, another nameless arrest in a city that never slept. But for those who touched his arm, who felt the unnerving steadiness of his composure, it was anything but routine. Inside, the air was sharp with the scent of coffee and disinfectant. A desk sergeant looked up, eyebrow raised. What's this? Suspicious activity, one officer replied quickly. Wouldn't answer questions. The sergeant's eyes drifted over the man, taking in the straight posture, the calm gaze. His frown deepened. Doesn't look like your usual drunk or vagrant. The officer shrugged. Doesn't matter. He's here now. We'll sort it out. The man was led down a narrow hallway, his cuffs glinting faintly under the fluorescent lights. At the end of the hall, a small room waited, a place designed to strip a man of his defenses, to leave him bare in the face of authority. The door closed behind them with a metallic echo. The man sat where they told him, folding his hands neatly on the table. His eyes were calm, steady, unwavering. To the officers, he was silent defiance. To himself, he was simply waiting. Waiting for them to learn the truth. Chapter 4, Inside the Station. The heavy steel door of the interview room closed with a hollow thud that echoed in the man's chest but didn't seem to rattle him. The sound was meant to intimidate, to remind suspects that once inside, the world beyond was cut off. But to him, it was nothing more than a familiar note in a melody he had heard before. The room was sterile, designed with purpose. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their relentless glare erasing shadows, leaving no place to hide. The table in the center was metallic, scratched with the faint graffiti of past suspects who had carved initials or doodles to pass the time. The walls were bare, painted in dull gray, the kind of color that made minutes feel like hours. The man sat down without being asked, folding his hands in front of him with a deliberate calm. He leaned back slightly, shoulders squared, posture impeccable. His eyes, cold, calculating, scanned the room as though cataloging every detail, the tiny vent in the ceiling, the smudge on the two-way mirror, the faint camera lens tucked into the corner. The officers didn't sit right away. They stood, watching him, trying to decipher his silence. It was unnerving. Most suspects fidgeted or slumped, avoiding eye contact. This man didn't. His gaze was steady, unflinching, like a teacher waiting for students to catch up. "Name?" the lead officer demanded, breaking the silence. His tone was firm, authoritative. The man didn't answer. His eyes flicked briefly toward the officer, then back to the table. "Sir, we need your name," the second officer pressed. "This will go a lot easier if you cooperate." Still nothing. The lead officer exhaled sharply, pulling out a chair and dropping into it with a controlled thud. He leaned forward, forearms on the table, trying to close the space between them. "Listen, I don't know what game you think you're playing, but this isn't going to work. You're in custody. That means we ask questions, you give answers. That's how this goes." The man remained still, his expression unreadable. Minutes ticked by. The clock on the wall seemed louder than usual, each second dragging its weight across the silence. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, silently debating their next move. Finally, the second officer pulled out a small notepad. "All right then. If you won't tell us your name, we'll start with your pockets." He reached into the man's jacket, careful but deliberate. The man didn't resist, he simply allowed it, his eyes following the officer's movements with quiet intensity. From the inside pocket, the officer produced a small, worn leather wallet. He placed it on the table, glancing at his partner. "Go on," the lead officer said. The wallet was flipped open. A driver's license slid free, the plastic catching the harsh overhead light. The officer picked it up, squinting at the name. His brows furrowed. He read it once, then again, his lips parting slightly as if unsure he was seeing correctly. "What is it?" the other officer asked, leaning closer. The first officer didn't answer right away. He looked up, his face pale. Then he handed the license across. The second officer scanned the name, and his expression mirrored his partner's: shock, disbelief, then something closer to fear. The room's atmosphere shifted instantly. Where moments ago they had held authority, now they felt it slipping through their fingers like sand. The man, still cuffed, leaned forward just slightly. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, not mocking, not arrogant, but knowing. As if the silent game was finally tipping in his favor. The officers swallowed hard. They had seen the name before, read about it in briefings, heard it in whispers. It was a name tied to operations classified above their clearance, missions they were never meant to know. The lead officer stood abruptly, pushing back his chair. "Stay here," he muttered, though it was more to himself than to the suspect. He grabbed the ID and left the room in quick, uneven strides. The second officer lingered for a moment, staring at the man across the table. The silence pressed in heavier than ever. Finally, he muttered, "Who the hell are you?" The man's only reply was the same silence he'd given all night, steady, deliberate, powerful. The officer turned and left, the doors slamming shut once again, leaving the man alone in the buzzing, fluorescent cage. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes briefly. To anyone else, it might have looked like boredom. In truth, it was patience. He knew what was coming. He knew the ripple effect his name would cause. And he was waiting for the storm. Chapter 5, The Shocking Discovery. The hallway outside the interview room was suddenly alive with quiet urgency. The lead officer clutched the ID in his hand like it was a live grenade, his pulse hammering in his throat. He moved quickly past desks and ringing phones, ignoring the curious looks from fellow officers. The laminated card seemed to burn in his grip, its letters echoing louder and louder in his mind. He reached the chief's office and knocked once, sharply. "Come in," came the muffled reply. The officer pushed the door open, stepping inside. The chief of police sat behind a desk cluttered with reports, his glasses perched low on his nose. He barely looked up at first. "What is it?" The officer placed the ID on the desk with trembling fingers. "Sir, we just brought someone in. And this is who he is." The chief glanced at the card, uninterested, then froze. His eyes narrowed, then widened, his entire body stiffening as recognition sank in. Slowly, he picked up the license, reading the name aloud in a whisper. For a long moment, there was silence. The chief set the card down carefully, almost reverently, as though afraid to damage it. He looked up at the officer, his voice low. "You're certain this is real?" "Yes, sir," the officer said, his throat dry. "We pulled it straight from his pocket. He hasn't spoken a word since we stopped him." The chief leaned back, exhaling a shaky breath. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" The officer shifted uneasily. "We thought he was suspicious. He wouldn't talk, wouldn't identify himself. We brought him in." "You arrested him," the chief interrupted, his voice rising in disbelief. "Without cause? Without backup? My God!" He stood abruptly, pacing the length of his office. His hand raked through his graying hair as he muttered under his breath. The officer caught fragments, words like classified, operation, and unbelievable. Finally, the chief stopped, turning to face him. His expression was grim, tinged with fear. "That man is not just some civilian you can question at your leisure. That man is a federal agent. And not just any agent, he's one of the highest decorated operatives in the country. His missions, his clearance," the chief shook his head, lowering his voice. "We shouldn't even know his name, let alone have him sitting in one of our interview rooms." The officer felt his stomach sink. The weight of their mistake crashed over him. "Sir, what do we do?" "You don't do anything," the chief snapped. "I'll handle this. And you," he jabbed a finger toward the officer, "you pray this doesn't cost you your badge." The officer nodded quickly, backing toward the door. "Yes, sir." When the door closed, the chief let out another long breath. He picked up the ID again, staring at the name as though it might vanish if he blinked. Then he straightened his jacket, squared his shoulders, and walked briskly down the hall. Inside the interview room, the man still sat quietly, his hands folded neatly on the table. His expression hadn't changed, though the faintest trace of amusement lingered at the corners of his mouth, as if he already knew what was coming. The door opened sharply. The chief entered, his voice booming with authority, though his eyes betrayed unease. "Remove those cuffs," he barked to the officer standing nearby. The officer hurried forward, fumbling with the keys. The cuffs clicked open, and the man rubbed his wrists slowly, methodically. He didn't thank them. He didn't need to. The chief cleared his throat, his earlier bluster fading into something closer to deference. "Agent," he began, the word carrying more weight than the others in the room could grasp. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding. My men weren't aware of who you were. On behalf of the department, I offer my sincerest apologies." The man finally looked up, his eyes locking on the chief's. There was no anger there, no smugness, just the quiet authority of someone who knew the power of silence. The officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence crumbling into shame. They hadn't just detained a stranger. They had interfered with something far larger than themselves. The chief cleared his throat again, trying to fill the oppressive silence. "If there's anything we can do to make this right." The man lifted a hand, silencing him with a single gesture. Then, in a voice calm but edged with steel, he spoke for the first time. "Next time," he said evenly, "make sure you know who you're arresting." The words hung in the air like a blade suspended above their heads. The chief swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "Understood." The man stood, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the door. No one moved to stop him. No one dared. The silence that followed his departure was louder than any siren. The officers were left speechless. And shaken. Chapter 6, The Truth Revealed. The chief's office was quiet, its blinds drawn shut against the world outside. The desk lamp cast a small circle of amber light, leaving the corners of the room in heavy shadow. On the desk lay the wallet and the identification card, the same card that had turned the entire station upside down only minutes ago. Chief Robert Hale stared at it as though it were a relic from another world. His fingers hovered over the plastic, hesitant, as if touching it might bring consequences he wasn't prepared to face. He had been in law enforcement for over 20 years. He had seen his share of violent criminals, powerful politicians, and even federal agents. But this was different. That name. That face. He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning under his weight. The memory of the man's calm eyes in the interview room returned to him, how those eyes had looked at him, not with defiance, not even with hostility, but with the cool certainty of someone who knew he was untouchable. Someone who knew he commanded power beyond the walls of this station. A knock on the door snapped him from his thoughts. "Come in," Hale said, his voice lower than usual. The door creaked open and Sergeant Mitchell stepped inside, the officer who had first arrested the man. His face was pale, his posture stiff. He looked less like a cop and more like a soldier awaiting judgment. "Sir," Mitchell began, I need to know. Who is he? Really?" Hale studied him for a moment, debating how much he should reveal. Most of what he knew wasn't supposed to be spoken aloud. Even within law enforcement, names like his were spoken in hushed tones, always prefaced with, "You didn't hear this from me." Finally, Hale gestured for him to sit. "Close the door." Mitchell obeyed, lowering himself into the chair opposite. His eyes kept flicking toward the ID on the desk, as if afraid it might burst into flames. "You want the truth?" Hale said, his voice deliberate. "You've got to understand something first. That man is not just a federal agent. He's one of the highest-level operatives in the country. Black Ops, counterintelligence, operations so classified most of Washington doesn't even know they happened. His record is cleaner than any medal list, because most of it doesn't exist on paper. You hear me?" Mitchell swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." Hale leaned forward, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "He's been behind missions overseas that prevented wars before they even started. Infiltrations, dismantling terror cells, extracting assets so valuable they could topple governments if they fell into the wrong hands. He's been in places we'll never know about, doing things this department couldn't begin to imagine. And tonight," Hale tapped the ID card, "you put him in handcuffs." Mitchell's stomach sank further. His throat went dry. We thought he was just some guy, loitering. He wouldn't talk." "Of course he wouldn't," Hale snapped. "You think someone like him can just blurt out who he is?" Men like him live in the shadows for a reason. He was probably mid-mission, gathering intel, maybe even testing if this city's force was compromised. And you treated him like some drunk off the street. Mitchell's hands curled into fists on his knees. He felt sick. Sir, what happens now? What if this gets back to his people? Hale sat back, rubbing his temples. If we're lucky, nothing. He didn't seem interested in making this official. If he reports it, he exhaled. We'll have Washington breathing down our necks by morning. Careers could end. Yours, mine, half this department. Mitchell's voice dropped to a whisper. So, what do we do? The chief looked at him steadily. We do nothing. We forget this ever happened. We pray he forgets too. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of the truth. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner and the distant murmur of radios from the bullpen. Finally, Mitchell found his voice again. Sir, he smiled. Hale frowned. What? When we uncuffed him. Just before he left. He smiled, like he knew something. Like he was warning us. Hale's jaw tightened. He remembered the same faint curve of the lips, the quiet power behind it. Not arrogance, not mockery. A warning. That wasn't a smile, Hale said grimly. That was a reminder. He wanted us to know exactly how small we are compared to him. And he wanted us to remember it. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the weight of his mistake pressing down harder with every passing second. He looked at the ID again, then back to Hale. What's his name going to mean for us now? Hale didn't answer right away. He picked up the card, stared at it, then slid it back into the wallet. He closed the leather with care, as though sealing away a secret too dangerous to linger in the open. Finally, he looked up. His voice was low, almost reverent. His name, Hale said, means power. It means protection. And it means danger. He's the kind of man who can disappear for months, then reappear in the middle of a crisis and end it before it begins. The kind of man who doesn't need permission, only results. And we were stupid enough to chain him like a petty thief. Mitchell sat in silence, shame burning his cheeks. Hale leaned forward once more, his voice a warning now. You keep this to yourself. You don't mention his name. Not to your family, not to the other officers, not even in your dreams. You understand? Mitchell nodded quickly. Yes, sir. The chief slid the wallet into a locked drawer of his desk and turned the key. The metallic click echoed like a verdict. Good. Because men like him, if they want to vanish you, they don't need paperwork. The room fell into silence again. And for both men, the truth weighed heavier than the mistake itself. Chapter 7, The Apology. The station was quieter than usual, though every officer moved with restless energy. Whispers passed between desks, nervous glances shot toward the closed interview room. Everyone knew something was wrong, terribly wrong, but no one dared ask. Chief Hale's shoes clicked against the polished floor as he walked back toward the room. He had locked the agent's ID in his desk drawer, but the weight of it seemed to follow him down the hall. Each step felt heavier, as if he were marching toward a verdict he wasn't sure he wanted to face. Behind him trailed Sergeant Mitchell and two other officers, their faces tight with dread. They had been there from the start, had been the ones to place the cuffs, to treat the man like a suspect. Now they were about to stand in front of him again, but the balance of power had shifted entirely. Hale stopped outside the door. For a moment he simply stood there, breathing in, squaring his shoulders. He knew the department would never look smaller than it did tonight. But some mistakes required humility, no matter how much it stung. He opened the door. The man was still sitting at the table, just as they had left him. His hands were no longer cuffed, but they rested calmly in front of him, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, but his eyes, those steady, unblinking eyes, remained the same. Patient. Watchful. Silent. The room felt colder when he looked up at them. Hale stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Agent," he began, the title sharp in the air. The other officers stiffened. "There's no easy way to say this, so I'll be direct. What happened tonight was a mistake. A grave mistake." The man said nothing. Hale continued, his voice firm but edged with unease. "My men acted out of caution. They believed they were doing their duty. But ignorance is no excuse. We treated you with suspicion when we should have shown you respect. For that, I take full responsibility. And I apologize." The silence stretched, filling the small room. Every officer in it felt the weight of their error pressing down. Finally, Hale gestured toward Mitchell. The sergeant stepped forward reluctantly, his voice faltering. "Sir. Agent. I was the one who stopped you. The one who placed the cuffs. I didn't know. If I had, things would have been different. I'm sorry." His words hung in the air like a weak offering. He knew they weren't enough. The agent leaned back slightly, his gaze moving slowly from Mitchell to the other officers. His eyes lingered just long enough on each man to make them shift uneasily, as though he were reading their measure, weighing their worth. Then, for the first time, he spoke. His voice was low, steady, but carried with it a presence that made the air tighten. "You didn't know," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, delivered with a finality that made Mitchell's chest ache. "No, sir," Mitchell replied quickly. The agent's expression didn't change. "And yet you assumed. You acted without cause. You believed silence meant guilt. Tell me, Sergeant, how many innocent men have worn those cuffs because of your suspicion?" Mitchell's mouth went dry. He faltered, then dropped his gaze. "Too many." The agent nodded once, the movement so slight it was almost imperceptible. Then perhaps tonight wasn't wasted after all. The officers exchanged uncertain looks. The words weren't forgiveness, but neither were they condemnation. Chief Hale stepped forward again, urgency creeping into his tone. "Agent, please understand, we meant no harm. If there is anything we can do to make amends." The agent's eyes snapped to him, and Hale fell silent instantly. He didn't need to be told twice. For a long moment, the agent said nothing. Then, slowly, he rose from the chair. His height seemed to fill the small room, his presence suddenly dominating. He adjusted his jacket with measured precision, the faintest smirk touching his lips. "Apologies don't erase mistakes," he said quietly. "But they do remind me that some men still recognize when they've overstepped. That counts for something." The chief bowed his head slightly. "Thank you, Agent." The man walked toward the door. The officers instinctively stepped aside, giving him space as though he carried an invisible force around him. At the threshold, he paused. Without turning, he spoke one last time. "Remember this," he said. "Next time you stop someone on suspicion, think before you act. A wrong assumption can cost more than your career. It can cost lives." The words cut deeper than any reprimand. And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. The room remained silent long after his departure. The officers stood frozen, staring at the empty chair as though it still held his presence. Finally, Hale exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "We're lucky," he muttered. "We're damn lucky." Mitchell swallowed hard, his heart still pounding. "Chief, will he report this?" Hale shook his head slowly. "I don't know. But if he does, God help us." The silence returned, heavier than before. They had apologized, yes, but deep down, every man in that room knew the truth. The mistake would follow them forever, whether or not the agent chose to speak of it. Chapter 8, A Silent Warning. The night air was cool when the man stepped out of the station. A soft breeze moved through the empty lot, carrying the faint smell of rain and asphalt. The city beyond was still alive with flickering neon and the occasional rumble of passing cars, but here, in the shadow of the police station, it felt like the world had gone still, holding its breath as he emerged. The door closed behind him with a heavy click. Inside, silence lingered among the officers like a stain they couldn't wash away. Outside, the man moved with the same steady composure he had shown from the beginning. His hands slid back into the pockets of his jacket, his stride calm, controlled. But every step was a reminder. The station windows glowed faintly behind him. He knew they were still watching, those officers, the chief, perhaps even others now called to attention by whispers traveling faster than paperwork ever could. They would never forget his face. And they would never forget the truth that had been dropped into their hands like a weight too heavy to carry. He paused at the edge of the lot. The street stretched before him, long and empty, just as it had been when they stopped him. Only now, the silence wasn't suspicion, it was respect. Fear, even. The kind that lingers after brushing shoulders with something far bigger than yourself. He turned his head slightly, glancing back at the building one last time. His eyes narrowed faintly, the faintest smile curving his lips. Not triumph. Not mockery. A warning. Inside the station, Chief Hale stood at a window, watching. His arms were crossed, but his knuckles were white, his jaw clenched. Mitchell hovered behind him, unsure whether to speak. "Chief," Mitchell finally said, his voice low. Hale didn't turn. His eyes stayed locked on the figure walking into the night. "Remember this moment, Sergeant. Burn it into your memory. Because men like him," Hale exhaled slowly, "they don't forgive. They just remember. And when they remember, the world listens." Mitchell swallowed, his chest tight. "Do you think he'll report us?" Hale shook his head, his voice almost a whisper. "No. He won't waste his time with reports. His silence is louder than any reprimand." They watched as the man reached the far end of the street, his shadow stretching long under the flickering lamps. Then, as though the night itself swallowed him, he disappeared around a corner. Gone. But the weight of his presence remained. For the agent, the walk back into the city was nothing more than another step in a long mission. Tonight's interruption had been inconvenient, yes, but it had also served its purpose. He had seen the department up close, seen their weaknesses, their instincts, the cracks in their judgment. He hadn't needed words to test them. Silence had been enough. He thought of the cuffs, the officers' nervous questions, the fumbling attempts at authority. They had believed themselves in control. They had believed they were the hunters. And yet in the end, they had been the ones exposed, unmasked by their own assumptions. He knew they would tell no one. Fear would keep their tongues tied tighter than any order ever could. And fear was useful. Fear reminded men of their limits. A storm was coming, he felt it in the currents of the city, in the faint electricity humming in the air. His mission wasn't done. The real work lay ahead, hidden in alleys and rooftops, in shadows where men whispered secrets they thought no one could hear. That was his world. That was his war. The police station, the arrest, the apology, it was already fading behind him. But one truth remained, they would not forget him. And if their paths ever crossed again, they would remember the warning written in silence. Back at the station, Hale finally turned from the window. His face was pale, his eyes sunken with the weight of realization. He looked at Mitchell, then at the other officers who had gathered in uneasy silence. "Tonight," he said quietly, "we learned something. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it whispers. Sometimes, it says nothing at all. And that's when you know it's real." No one spoke. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the sound harsh in the silence. Every man in that room carried the same thought, they had been given a glimpse into a world beyond their reach. A world where silence was deadlier than bullets, where a single name could silence an entire department. And they would never look at an empty street the same way again. The agent moved deeper into the city, swallowed by darkness, his figure vanishing into the hum of distant traffic. He carried no badge in his hand, no weapon drawn, no explanation offered. Only silence. But his silence was not empty. It was a warning, one that would echo long after he was gone. And those who had heard it would never forget.